All right. So I think we've got some people coming in. Sorry for the delay. I didn't realize we weren't going to have a moderator, and they changed the credentials on us. So, but here we go. There they are. Anyway, I'm Chris Prue, so I'm actually going to be the presenter as well as the moderator. Hopefully, y'all can hear me. So I want to draw your attention to first. I'll share my screen here. All right. You'll notice here in the lower right-hand corner, there's a little chat feature, and it goes into the matrix when I do that. But so that's where you can ask some questions. So we'll finish up, and then we will take some questions at the end. That's probably the easiest way instead of verbalizing it, because it creates a bit of a challenge for us to organize that. So it's 12:04 Eastern time, so we're gonna get right into it. So first off, I want to thank MyoGuard for organizing this and pushing it out to their group. As I said, my name is Chris Prue. I'm the director of education at Digitsole. I'm also in private practice, and have been using something like this for many years. If I had the moderator, then I would ask a question, have y'all response like, what kind of equipment do you all use as far as the testing? Not sort of the surrogate measures, range of motion, things like that, but more performance-based outcome measures. So, for example, gosh, I think one of my first, at least the one that I used the most, was the Just Jump mat system. I still have it today. So it's a switch mat that you can use to measure vertical jump height. So you can do single leg, double leg, you do counter movement. And basically it's using an algorithm where it is measuring flight time. And so from there, you can get various other types of outputs, which again include things like center of mass displacement or jump height. You can actually get a power index, so you can do some repeated jumps and things like that. It was really cool. The delta on it was really good. It wasn't that sensitive, unfortunately. But we've got a lot more technology at our fingertips today. Hopefully, that makes it a little bit easier for us, but also gives us some metrics to look at. So I'll talk more about that as we get into this, especially something like running. And so the main topic of this is, how can we utilize technology for the most part in terms of working with runners, either in the prevention, in the performance aspect, and potentially in the rehabilitation aspect. And like any other athlete or any other performance outcome measure, and you could, fill in the blank here with like a squat or something like that, where you have different levels of readiness. You have people that are brand new, so they have no experience. You have some people with some experience, then you have some people that are well trained. So although running is an event in and of its own, it's also considered sort of, one of those subcategories. So this is a disclaimer, because if you are a certified athletic trainer and you want to use this as part of your category D. So category D means that it's not something that's pre-approved, and it's not something that someone is using a provider number for. So category D is basically stuff that you did on your own. And unless it's changed, you get 10 hours for that. We just had recertification, or you did. I'm no longer an athletic trainer. I'm retired from that aspect. But so anyway, you can use this as a category D. I put an email address at the end here that you can submit and ask for a certificate of attendance, and we can provide that for you as part of your records. So as a result of that, we also claim that, or we disclaim that conflict of interest. So I do work for a manufacturer. We are not promoting a product in this presentation, which is why you can still classify it under a category D. And even though it's sponsored by manufacturers, they are not uh, an endorsement or promotion in the sale, the effectiveness, the quality, or the safety of any product. So that's your standard disclaimer with the BOC, just so we all understand that this is not a sales pitch. In terms of a product, it's a sales pitch for me because I get on my horse here and get to talk about why I think we should do a better job at collecting data and utilizing it to inform our decision-making process. So when it comes to that, we have some different opportunities to implement this process. So we can implement it on the baseline testing, we can implement it on the benchmark testing, and then certainly we can implement it during the rehabilitation or the intervention process. A lot of people like to use baseline testing, and in athletic training, which is, I think, what a lot of people are on this particular webinar, is they do a lot of baseline testing. But if you're in the outpatient clinics, you don't really get to do that, right? Because typically they come in as a result of having the injury or post-surgical procedures and things like that. So you're more so going to be looking at benchmark testing or comparison to normative data. So there are some different opportunities of how we can actually implement this formulation. Obviously, it'd be great if we could get baseline data, because there are some characteristics that are different from one person to the next, but there are also some characteristics that we do have as far as normative values, and we'll get into a little bit of that. So I want to look at the evolution, and then I want to look at the environmental evolution of performance, and I'm actually going to show and use some case characteristics for that. So we'll have a little bit of an introduction. I like to talk about the biomechanics of whatever it is I'm going to talk about, especially, or the physiology, the neurophysiology, the neuromechanics, whatever the case may be, just to make sure that we're all on the same page, because it helps to connect some of what it is that we're talking about as to why. Why should I bother doing something like this? And for example, I'll use a couple of particular use cases that, if you have that background, it makes a little bit more sense as to what the purpose is for, and then we'll summarize that and get into a conclusion. And like I said, we can do some Q&A. I always like to start off with a quote, and this is a great one because we're inundated with a lot of data, because technology has moved so fast and far forward that some of us, if you remember back during our academic preparation, you were introduced to the lab where, there was a lot of biomechanical equipment, for example. And then we may never have really got to see that and use it again, just because of, the accessibility to it, or the cost, or its even usefulness. And so this is actually from Zox, who's a sport technologist with the USOC, United States Olympic Committee, and that it's great we can collect data, but it's how we respond or utilize that information that really makes the difference, because we can collect data about anything. And we've really gone leaps and bounds ahead of, even when I was in grad school, and we defined, a research project as coming up with a hypothesis, and then answering the question with a methodology versus just looking at the data and just collecting whatever kind of data is possible, and then trying to find patterns, because we actually refer to that as data mining. And so it increases your chances of a certain type error, right? Versus where we are today, because we can actually run a lot more advanced algorithms than we used to be able to back in the day. And that data science has become much more of its own entity. You can get a degree in data science and data analytics, and look at and utilize the data in, for example, predictive patterns, which, if you think about, when we're doing post-intervention or accumulated case studies, even meta-analyses, we're looking for those patterns of the previously accumulated data. So some of the things that we talk about in running, and in fact, we use a lot of post data, because, as we'll get into, the prediction when it comes to potential opportunities to determine whether or not someone's going to be injured, that's always been a challenge for us, especially in team sports, because we know that there's the contact versus the non-contact types of injuries, and we can't possibly control for everything. But then we look at running as an event in and of itself, and well, you're probably not going to get sideswiped. No one's going to take your legs out, typically. So a lot of those injuries are sort of that non-contact overuse, things like that. In terms of, well, that makes it a little bit more standard in terms of the variable. So there are some things that we do think that we do look at right now. So when we look at, for example, the impact forces, we know higher impact forces are worse. We don't necessarily know what that number is. It's also relative to your body mass. Heel strike versus midfoot striking or toe striking. Some of that has to do with the biomechanics, and there are pros and cons to that. So the foot striking, debate is still ongoing, and we'll have a little bit of that discussion, today. So here's one of the things I always do. I like to get as much normative data as I can, and we know that with walking there is more normative data. So I can actually look at a walker's profile or a walking profile, even of someone who's a runner, and get some detailed information. And that actually helps to give me a pseudo baseline, even if I didn't get them at the very beginning. And so we look at walking as a lower level form of running to some extent. Yes, I know they're different. And we all joke that, technically speaking, you don't have to walk before you can run. Although that's not really true. You look at the evolution of, a child during growth and development, and some may go into walking really fast and look like running. It's probably because they're trying to keep themselves from falling. But the reality of it is that locomotion effect when it comes to walking and integrating a lot of those features that we see are really important to running. One would argue that, it's going to be pretty important. So gait, looking at this timed execution. So there's a lot of components to it when we look at the involuntary and the reflexive patterns, along with the voluntary and the non-reflexive patterns, things that we actually have some control over, things that we can actually do some training with. So for example, stride length alone, a full gait cycle going from heel strike of one foot to heel strike of the other foot is something that a lot of us talk about in running, because it's one of those key components that we use in terms of training runners as far as making them go faster. Sort of an in-between and looking at a single characteristic of one limb during that swing phase is going to be that step. Again, not that it's necessarily less important. It is going to be very important if we need to break that down due to something that's potentially going on. Now, if we can get into some of the details of locomotion, the anatomy and the forces, as I mentioned earlier, there's some predictive patterns when we look at, strike forces, in that, we try to reduce that because that's linked to some of these injury characteristics that we test a lot, especially when it comes to things like jumping and landing. And then, of course, we've got the influence of the cardiovascular, the respiratory, the metabolic influences with regards to that running, and certainly need to take into consideration depending on what's going on. So it's interesting if we can look at some degree of player load, for example, is really popular today, to look at, the interaction, the amount of effort, and frankly, the amount of forces that a player comes involved with during a specific event, such as a game or a practice session. Well, in running, we can kind of look at that in terms of, what does it look like, their characteristics during the first kilometer, second, third, fourth, fifth kilometer, for example, if you're dealing with a 5 kilometer running. So it's a similar aspect of kind of looking at that player load development. But if we can actually capture, some of those characteristics, then that would be pretty cool, to be able to evaluate that. So the main differences between walking and running, and they share so much, which is why arguably we can say, yeah, you really do need to start with walking. And again, because it's so reflexive and there's a lot of neurological patterns, such as your cross crawl pattern, that it really makes excellent, evaluative procedure for the multi-systems aspect of the fitness or the health of the particular individual that you're looking at. So the largest characteristic between walking and running is actually going to be that running has a flight phase. Walking has a double support phase where you have 2 feet in contact with the ground. And in fact, if you've ever watched speed walking events, for example, they cannot have a flight phase. And that's why they have so many judges along those courses, is to make sure that people do not end up into a flight phase, because there is a certain inherent advantage when you do have a flight phase in terms of especially your stride, right? Because speed is the product of the stride duration and the stride length. And if we can shorten the stride duration and increase the stride length, we're going to run faster, right? So that's another way of looking at cadence. So for example, if I could just take someone's stride length and it stayed exactly the same. So for example, up here, we have an 89-inch stride length on that left foot. If I just kept it that way, but had them improve or increase their cadence, they're going to run faster, right? It's not unusual that one's going to change a little bit more than the other, and it's going to kind of go back and forth as we're getting to the upper levels of training. But oftentimes we'll see an increase in the stride length along with the cadence, obviously, as people are going to run faster. So here's a perfect example of looking at some of those differences. If you're looking from a performance perspective, why are we having some difficulties in getting this runner to run a little bit faster? We see right here that this particular person has a difference of about 3.5 inches in their stride running at that particular speed, right? Things change. So as we increase speed, some things that are very consistent is you will see an increase in the double float percentage, right? Because they're going to spend more time in the air, because they're going to have greater propulsion, right? As they toe off, they're going to basically leap into the air, and they're going to spend more time in what's referred to as the flight phase or that double float phase. So unlike walking, walking at the typical average for an adult, which is approximately 3.0 miles per hour or 5.1 kilometers per hour, we typically have that 60-40 split where there's 60% in the stance phase, 40% is going to happen in the swing phase. That really shifts when you're running. And then what you'll see is the swing phase, as a person starts to run faster, is going to have a higher percentage of that complete cycle, and the stance phase is going to reduce. And again, we're going to see an increase in that double float phase. So there aren't any very specific characteristics with regards to averages like the 60-40 split that we see in walking, but we do have some of those representations that do matter. And again, with today's technology, a lot of these systems can actually develop these algorithms, and they can take into account things like the demographics of the person. So if there is some normative data out there, for example, that someone at a certain height or leg length, limb length should be able to run, or what their stride should look like at a certain speed, we can actually get some of those characteristics. And actually, here's an example. If you look over here on the left, we see that at 7 miles an hour, based on the characteristics, the demographics of this particular athlete, it shows that the cadence is a little bit slow, right? It's on the low end, and that's what this coloration means in amber. Red, as you look over here on the right, means that it's abnormal. We'll talk about that in a second. This is very common when we look at people that are trained. In other words, it means that they're maximizing their stride length based on their demographics and that particular speed. And then we look over here, and this is also very typical that we see that we don't have a lot of really good sprint or running really, really fast characteristics. So we see that the cadence is in the red here, and that's suggesting that not maximizing that speed. The reason here is because of the contact and the actual speed that this person is running at. And I'll show you that in a moment here. But so eventually, as you start to run really, really fast, those algorithms can diminish a little bit. So really the characteristics of what we're addressing right now is basically like a long distance runner, not an athlete who's necessarily running on a field for speed. Also, in comparison, when we look at walking versus running, there's a lot more muscular activity with regards to what's going on during that support phase, as well as even the drive leg phase, right? Because we're going to use a lot more propulsive activity when we are running versus when we are walking. So when we're walking, we just kind of we offset our center of mass, we move it in the direction that we're going to be going in, and we just basically fall forward. It's not quite that simple, but we do use that what's referred to as a pendular effect versus when it comes to running, there's a lot more effort involved in that process. And so the efficiencies are actually going to change a little bit. Now, when we're running as fast as we can, we're typically going to be on the ball of the foot, also known as the forefoot. So if you are running at top speed, such as during a sprinting event, we also see changes in the ground reaction forces. If we were to break down that 100-meter sprint, we would see that when you come out of the blocks, you have a very forward leaning position, and the orientation of your ground reaction forces are very, very horizontal, and we're starting from a dead stop. So rate of force development is something that's real important getting out of the blocks. So a lot of strength development when it comes to coming out of the blocks. Then we start to transition and we start to see a more upright position as we start to begin a really high degree of acceleration. And then as we're reaching sort of that peak acceleration, we consider that more of that power phase. And so the transition of that leg to leg, right to left in driving is going to be really important. And that's why power, right, which is going to be a unit or a rate of velocity change, is very important. And then when we're running full speed, a lot of those ground reaction forces are pretty much just perpendicular. And if we were to be able to calculate and look at the change, okay, why did Usain Bolt, what changed? And you would see that ground reaction forces increased and ground contact times decreased, right? Because technique probably didn't change a whole lot when you're at that particular level. So that's the physics of that example, right? But let's assume that we're not all these Olympic world class runners and not always running at top speed, then it makes a difference, right? And so to break that down, if it takes you between 40 and 60 meters to get to top speed, and if we look at the average distances in soccer or football, if you're in the rest of the world, and that range is typically 5 to 20 meters, they never actually reach top speed, right? So it's more about the acceleration. It's more about running at those sub-level peak velocities. Slower running, it's either going to be a heel or a midfoot or sometimes a whole foot strike. Some of that's going to be characteristic based on how they were trained or what they want to accomplish, and even some of that shoe wear. We'll get back into that in a moment here. Um, the flexed leg is going to be much different as you're going through the swing phase than when you are in the walking, because you do not need not only as much ground clearance, but you don't need that drive that you have that we find in running versus walking. And then also as we get into that extension, because the flight phase and the strides are not going to be as long as walking, we tend not to reach out necessarily as far. But what also happens is we can offset our center of mass different in walking than running, where basically if we go too far when it comes to running, there's a lot more of that braking mechanism. So it actually slows you down. And that's why coordinating that stride length relative to your speed is pretty important. Support time is going to decrease. Well, when you have that horizontal translation, that actually adds to some of the balance or equilibrium components, where you don't have to have the same type of balance when you're running as when you're walking, which is why, again, they're slightly different, but walking actually, again, has its own characteristics of why it's worth it. Just in general, overall, the movement activities in running are going to be a lot more involved and a lot more necessary. It's a much greater component with regards to the overall performance. We see that, over on the right here, that the walking, like I said, is much more disruptive. We're offsetting our center of mass. We're collecting ourselves. We're actually using that offset as an advantage and to some degree a level of proficiency. but the patterns are also going to be very, very similar, where we see this sort of cross crawl pattern going on. We see some slight sways moving back and forth because of the pendulum action and walking, but we see it a little bit less in the running because the base of support does not need to be as wide, right? It can be closer together. And so we can actually take advantage of that opportunity when we're moving into a faster locomotion than we are when we are walking. Now, the striking pattern is something that is really commonly discussed. And it really depends what you want to accomplish, because there are some advantages and disadvantages to really any of these. Basically, if you're toe striking, and you're not running at full speed, that's going to create actually a bit of a limitation. There's going to be too much braking as a result of that. So it's usually going to come down to the differences between a heel strike and a midfoot strike, or someone will refer to that as sort of that whole foot strike. So when you heel strike, you're usually going to be landing on the lateral aspect of the calcaneus, so the back part of the heel. And oftentimes that's going to be highly influenced by the types of shoes that people wear. And so if it has a really large heel cup to it, that can actually influence the way that they're going to strike the ground and relatively how they're going to respond as they're going through that stance phase. But basically, normally you're going to heel strike whether you're wearing a shoe or not. We typically won't want to heel strike if you're not wearing a shoe, because you're not going to have that cushioning effect. And it can be very uncomfortable and can eventually lead to an inflammatory response, either on the bone itself or within the fat pad that overlies that area, and potentially have some negative influence on the plantar fascia and even the Achilles tendon over time. So people that do not want to heel strike will usually midfoot strike. And so we'll see a little bit difference with the midfoot strike, because you're going to have a little bit more neutral foot. It's as though you actually started in sort of that, what we refer to as foot flat position. So someone that heel strikes, they heel strike, then they put their toe down, and that's going to put them into what's referred to as foot flat position. Then they're going to lift their heel, and that's going to be the end of the foot flat position. And that's going to be the initiation of the propulsion phase. And then they're going to push off of that toe. With the midfoot, basically, it's like they're skipping the first initial part of heel strike, and they're going to go right into sort of that foot flat position. And some people even go a little bit into that toe position. But when they're really good, they want to take advantage of the cushioning or the recoil response and minimize that braking. So typically a heel striker is going to have a longer stride. So if you take the same person, have them heel strike, have them midfoot strike, you're going to have a longer stride in the heel strike, because they can reach out further. And they can actually go into a position of dorsiflexion, whereas a midfoot striker, you're going to be in more of a neutral position. And so the advantage of that midfoot is you're going to have typically a lower ground reaction force, right? So that force is going to be lower, at least the absorption of that, because now you're going to have not that straight out heel strike. You're going to have a little bit more opportunity to flex at the knee as well as the hip, because now that leg is going to be underneath you and you're not going to be reaching out to that. So let's move into from the initial to the mid stance. So if someone is going to heel strike, they're actually going to eventually put that foot down. They're going to move from that heel inversion, and they're also going to move from a more supinated position into a pronated position. Not necessarily pronation. Some people might, but that's kind of uncommon when you're in a shoe that has an arch to it, which most running shoes actually do. If you're wearing a minimalist, well, you're going to be more subjected to whatever your foot is capable of doing. But you're going to heel strike, and you're going to move into a fairly neutral position. The knee should flex, and you're going to get a slight valgus position, typically. Now, again, if people are genuvaris to begin with, then that may make a little bit of a difference. But in general, this is the normal position, and it's also going to be somewhat similar that we see in people that are walking. We see it more in running because they've taken their base of support and they've brought their feet a little bit closer together, right? So that's going to lead to, as we get into a little bit of absorption, we're going to get a little bit of hip flexion, hip adduction, and some slight internal rotation. And again, if you're thinking pathologically, if there's too much internal rotation, right, that's going to be internal rotation of the femur um, with valgus position of the knee, and relatively speaking, a rotational effect at the knee that we really don't want to see a lot, because that's going to increase that valgus deformity and potentially put more stress on some of these areas. So the faster someone runs, the more we will tend to see that. As we move from the late stance phase into the early swing phase, so now we're getting ready and we're beginning sort of that propulsion effect. Now the foot itself is going to go back into a basically a supinated position, or as some of us will call that sort of like the claws of a cat, as it's getting ready to basically grip the ground. And we see that a lot, especially if someone's trying to run as fast as they possibly can, like a sprinter. Now that's going to be at the fore to midfoot. Now the calcaneus, it still may remain in that slightly inverted or everted position. So that's what's going to be a little bit different, and also going to be characteristic to some extent of the type of shoe wear. We're going to be coming back up, so we're going to be elevating our center of mass and taking advantage of things like knee extension, hip extension, even a shoulder shrug, depending on how fast they're moving. And we'll see the opposite movement of the upper extremity. And typically when we're pushing off and we see that the rotation of the pelvis is going to go slightly posterior, and it's also going to rotate to that contralateral side. And to maintain your center of mass normally, your torso is actually going to rotate to the ipsilateral side. Okay. Now, this is also why the core stability activity is going to be really important and something to take into consideration when we are sort of evaluating these things. I think I got my little runner guy here again. Okay. Now, again, keep in mind that a lot of this is going to be to some extent individual as to how much, right? Because it's going to be based on their anatomical features of their feet all the way up to their head. And so that's why, again, we have some generalities to what we're describing here, but there are some, things when we look at the physics of running, which is why when we're trying to collect and look at data, that kind of stuff can be really important, right? So when it comes to the physics, if we're from a dead stop, we have to overcome inertia. And the faster we run, inertia is decreasing and momentum's actually increasing, right? So inertia meaning that an object at rest wants to stay at rest, or also when we're running at speed, an object in motion wants to stay in motion, especially if they're reduced external factors. So the acceleration, if we are trying to increase the speed, that's where that drive leg is extremely important. And the ability to transition from side to side, also extremely important. And again, to sort of throw a thought process out, imagine having an asymmetry in force production or power production of that lower extremity, and what that's going to do for us, right? Neurologically, reflexively, we want to be basically symmetrical. And so when we, back decades ago, when we started hearing about this complex motor theory, that kind of was like, okay, so even though there are some asymmetries, sometimes they can be difficult to detect unless you get into as we call the nitty gritty, because if you're just going to look at the performance outcome measure, such as running, you're not going to be able to detect that, because the body's naturally is going to want to create that symmetry, and it's actually going to hold back the leg that is a little bit stronger or potentially more powerful, right? So the length of these driving phases, again, really important. Think also about range of motion. My son is playing, just got picked for the all-star team for third and fourth graders, which is funny if there is an all-star team at that level. And there's one, little young man on there, and it reminds me when I watch him run of, what happens after someone has a hernia or double hernia, inguinal hernia operation. He does not get good flexion at the hips. He does not get good flexion at the knee. So he's really lacking, that drive leg capability. And so he has, a lot of limitations in his running. And, the clinician and the performance coach in me wants to go talk to the parents and tell them there's some stuff that we can do about that. But and that, those things are really important, and the sooner that we can get to those, I mean, the better. If you can imagine, proper mechanics, not only for performance aspect, but he tends to have really stiff landing activity even in jumping, and so he doesn't absorb a lot of that energy as he's landing, and again, playing basketball here. So, I know that was a very quick overview, and hopefully useful to sort of outline, some of the information that's important. But then we get into, can we use this data to predict running? So we think about, when I was first studying, strength and conditioning, and the first chapter, talks about what are the purposes. Well, the purposes are twofold. It was to reduce injury and to improve performance. And we struggled, back when I started all this a few years ago, with that provability that we can actually reduce injury with, sort of these interventions. Well, we know today that we can do a whole lot more, but we're still really sort of challenged because a lot of that more specific, detailed data, has to take place in a lab, and not all of us have access to the lab. So looking at especially these biomechanical factors, is kind of important. So when we look at predictors of running related injuries, it's pretty minimal, despite the amount of studies out there, and really despite what we may think. We do think that, vertical loading rates do have an impact. And so that's one thing that we can potentially start to look at now. And I'll also take a step back that, looking at the deltas or looking at the changes, certain things that can get better or worse, like relative positions of knee joint structures, hips, ankles, ranges of motions, things like that, which is what a lot of us, were doing preseason athletic training and athletic development, now more so in the sports science. We also see that changing cadences can have an impact, and just making someone run faster or slower without actually accommodating to those changes, which is why, one of my testing procedures is I often have people run at two different speeds. So I call that my stress load, and I'll talk a little bit about that here in a second. So there's some indication that we might have some of that, and as I said, the vertical loading forces is something that a lot of people are talking about. But again, how can you measure that? I mean, it typically, historically at least anyway, it took a fair bit of information and specific data that we were able to measure more so in the lab. One of the biggest things that we tend to see is sort of, were they injured before? So a lot of these studies doing comparisons between non-injured ever runners and those with previous injuries, that's where some of the comparisons, the previously injured tend to have higher vertical loading rates. Is that what led them to the injury? Was it because of the injury? So some of these things we're really still kind of trying to figure out. We know that changing a running pattern does change the technique. There was a moment in time where, I spent a lot of time looking at barefoot running, and we were comparing barefoot running to midfoot striking, low density footwear, all the way up to your typical heel strikers with a lot of the cushioning. And man, I would get some of these cross country runners would come in and they're changing their running pattern, but yet, they're wearing the same footwear, and, going from being a heel striker to a low profile wearer, you just can't do that. You can't heel strike in that. And that, it takes more effort and understanding that your stride length is going to be shorter if you want to transition from being a heel striker to sort of that midfoot striker. And so real important to take those things into consideration. Probably one of our biggest things is to look at the symmetry effects, right? Side to side differences. In general, we're sort of meant to be pretty symmetrical, not exact. So there should be some variability between the right and the left. And part of that's also going to be because there's variability on the right and variability on the left. In other words, there's intra and inter variability that is not only expected, it's actually necessary, right? Because that actually allows us to be able to um, change to a non-predictable environment. You know, if you're running cross country, for example, it's not perfectly flat. Even if you are running around a track, you know, there's going to be other people that might get in the way, try to cut in front of you, and things like that. So we're pretty limited, but you know, there is some predictability that we're able to look at as we start to see the use of new data and information with the technology that we have available today. When I think back to grad school, or even, you know, the lab that I was in charge of when I was in higher education, that was, you know, a $500,000. We're able to capture a lot of that same data today, and pretty darn close to it, out in the field, which is awesome, because that's going to change the way that we potentially look at, as well as be able to hopefully feed into some of these learning models, that we might be able to have a better opportunity to detect some of these injuries. So with new technology, there's things like artificial intelligence, deep learning, machine learning. The algorithms actually build on them, and again, they can take the various characteristics of the individuals, aggregate them, and create better opportunities or predictions. We're already seeing that. So we've seen some literature come out that we're able to actually look at some of those patterns, potentially better predict whether or not someone is at least optimizing their performance. But also, how do we make that connection between the other events during running, right? Breaking it down, like I said, in a sprinter, you know, we can break down the sprint. We know that there's a high correlation relationship between, you know, force and power production, and things like vertical jump testing, one repetition maximums, and things like that. So a lot of relationships in some of those surrogate measures, we're also finding that might be some good opportunities to think about that as we break down the aspects of running. So what does this all mean? I mean, some of the biggest evidence shows us that, well, if they've had a previous injury, um, you know, they're more likely to be injured again. Why is that? Could be because, you know, they have some biomechanical faults. They didn't retrain, possibly, maybe not. They didn't retrain as well as they should have. It could be also just a lack of understanding, could be during their growth and development. Other factors we see, changes like volume, intensities, environment. So those are factors that, you know, we know we should be easing into or making some changes. Hip strength is an actual surrogate that we can look at. Transitions or heel attack methods, whether we want a heel strike versus midfoot. And like I said, the symmetry, the asymmetry makes a lot of sense, but we never really, you know, had that capability or the opportunity to look at that. And then some of our more recent data also says, you know what, maybe we need to spend a little bit more time looking at the evolution, you know, these changes throughout time. So here's an example where we take different and varying running speeds. So think about it in terms of like a stress load. So sometimes in cognitive aspects, like we can add a cognitive test to a physical test and see what brain or brain speed integration looks like, their cognitive ability to basically take information in while it's more challenging, and what does their motor development look like. So we can even do that, you know, with motor, right? So basically what I can do here is I can have them run at two different speeds. So a treadmill works really well because I can control the exact speeds, and we can see. So this is a guy that, you know, running at 6.8 miles per hour, has some foot issues, especially on that left side, and I'll get into that in a moment, but at 6.8, really comfortable, not a lot of problems. Symmetry looks pretty good. Same thing with the strike patterns, is a rear foot striker. Strike forces are also the same from side to side. We can see, oops, I cut out down the bottom here, very close. I think it was an 83-inch stride length, so very similar characteristics. But now when we look down here, we see that, man, there's about a third difference in terms of the attack angle and in what we call the pronosupination angle, which is actually the rear foot comes in contact with the ground. Transitions normal, but then wackadoodle right here at propulsion. So the foot characteristics, something is off. And so that's even at what was otherwise considered to be this normal, 6.8 miles per hour. Yep, I was right. 81 versus 83. So not dramatic at this particular speed, except when we start to look at this. And that's real common that, people can compensate and overcome when they're not needing to necessarily push it really hard. So now we increase the speed. So studies have shown that when you increase by about 10 to 12%, you'll start to see some biomechanical changes, not necessarily negative, but just different. So that's why I like to make a change of at least a 10% speed difference. So we see that, still a normal cadence, but we start to see this asymmetry. And the asymmetry that we're looking at here is actually going to be contact time. So now they're spending 6% more contact on the right foot versus the left foot. The contact positions relatively similar, so that hasn't really changed a lot. We still see this 2-inch stride length difference, but what we start to see here is a further deviation. So this is actually looking at those characteristics. So the heel strike was very similar. We start to see an increase in the standard deviation, which usually means a motor control issue, right? So if you look over here on the right, that's actually the normal pattern. When they heel strike with a negative angle, it means that they're on the lateral aspect and then they're still towing off or propulsion in a slightly negative, which means that the foot is going into supination, the heel is staying basically neutral. But this foot position, he's rolling off, he's not transitioning over to the first and second ray like you should be. He's staying on the lateral aspect of the foot, and he actually goes even further lateral after foot flat position. And that has a dramatic influence on propulsion. Well, what I didn't tell you was, he has cuboid syndrome, and come to find out has 2 torn ligaments in the calcaneal cuboid, one in the dorsal, one in the calcaneal cuboid ligament. So if you know, I didn't get into a lot of specific detail, but that cuboid bone, that position is kind of important. And so he's really losing a lot of power. And that's why, when trying to train to run faster, it just is not happening, right? And as we continue and fatigue starts to set in, that ground contact. So basically what's happening is that right foot is slowing down to try and keep up and maintain symmetry with the other side. Okay, so that's where we see some really dramatic differences, and it was really in that contact time. Okay, so what I like to do a lot, especially with runners, is I do follow-up testing, because I needed to know, well, if contact time is increasing on that right side, is it because there's weakness on the right side, or is it the left side issue? Well, we looked at the trajectory in the contact phase, which we described in the biomechanics of running as pretty darn important when it comes to propulsion and, frankly, speed, especially if you want to run fast. So I like to do jump testing, especially power testing, vertical jump testing. And I've got an example here when we're looking at the single hop. So the single hop has been shown to be a high correlation to a single leg vertical. So it has a high correlation to some strength testing. And so we can look at the performance characteristics, and it looks like, seems to be jumping pretty good on that side. But what we look at over here, and this is referred to as contact stability, which is basically after landing, getting into the appropriate position as quickly as possible. And so we see that it's double on the left. And so he's got some obvious contact stability issues. Now, we saw that even with the running, because let me go back real quick. I guess one more here. We saw that these 2 thin lines on either side of the middle line is the standard deviation. So the standard deviation from heel strike all the way into propulsion increased as we increased the speed. So there are some stability issues, right? And so the ligamentous structures in the cuboid pretty important, and we need to make sure that that's stable, because that's also, contact of peroneus longus. So here's another example, and this one I think it's a cool video. So first off, let's look at the one on the right. These are two different people, two different athletes. So the one on the right, this is your normal pattern. Your heel strike on the lateral aspect of the foot. So a negative angle is indicative of inversion, right? Then foot goes down, it neutralizes 10 degrees, and then we transition into toe off, okay? And it's still slightly negative because you end up going back into supination. Now, this is in a shoe. This is shod, so this is not barefoot, right? So this is how a foot reacts in a shoe. And then I want you to look over here. So the pattern is a little bit straighter, but you got to look at the numbers. So this one is actually at negative 47. This one's at negative 50 degrees. So this guy is landing while running, right? Oh, negative 63 degrees, negative 51, negative 55 in his mid stance position. And at toe off, same thing. Extremely dramatic versus negative 19, negative 17 compared to negative 3, negative 51, right? So it's as though he's landing on his fifth ray and spending most of his time on that fifth ray. So again, that I like to do that kind of test to look at, well, how does someone run and how does someone jump? He's not a running athlete. He's a very high level American football player at the high school level. And what we see is, that foot position during running, if all he had to do was run straight, that would be wonderful. So why do we do stuff like this? Because again, it's this controlled challenge experience. Get ready. And it's horrible that I actually was able to capture this on film, because normally we only see that on because someone got injured and during television. But so this is indicative of why something needed to be changed. Fortunately, he wasn't injured. We relaxed. We did some follow-up testing, but his shoe wear needed correction and needed a whole lot of changes. This is an example looking at the environment. So this is a distance runner, and she's training for 5 kilometers. So she's just running at a normal pace right now. I ran her on a treadmill. Everything looked really, really good, but she struggles at home when she was training. So I gave her my sensors to put them in, and because they're not tethered, I can collect all this data, from a distance. And in fact, she went out and she ran an entire 5 kilometers, and so I can aggregate points at 15 seconds. And then she was running with her dog, so the dog actually had to stop and go to the bathroom. That's why it dips down. So I can actually look at a lot of this data at a specific point. And so here's the average. So we're looking at, she was running it on average of about 7.1 miles per hour. This is a specific moment in time. And so I'm looking at this and I'm like, this is very different than what I saw on the treadmill, but this is real world, right? This is where she trains. And I'm seeing a 6% increase in contact time on that left side. The attack angle's at 22 versus 20. I wouldn't really say that much of a difference, but oops, too fast. But what we see here is her stride length is 87.8 on one side and 83.9 on the other side. And that's a pretty dramatic difference, between those two. Well, come to find out, she runs on, up in New Hampshire, runs on a very crowned road. And so she's always running against traffic. And so basically what we're representing here is she's got this short leg syndrome. It's not real because of the crownness. The road is so crowned, but that's one of the reasons she was struggling. She wasn't in any pain or having issues yet, but we needed to make some changes to her training because eventually she probably was going to have an issue. Now, I can't refer you to the data that says that, the study that says that, but at least in my experience, people with short legs, they tend to have some other issues going on. And basically that's what happened as a result of that. So there's often an over under on me, whether or not I'm going to make it within the time frame. But Anyway, so we made it. Listen, if you do want a certificate of completion, whether you're an athletic trainer or not, please email us at education@digitsole.com. That's education@digitsole.com. And we have a thank you to MyoGuard. So they're the ones who sponsored this to get this out to everyone. And hopefully this was of some use to you. And let's see if there are any questions. Kick me out there for a second. Ask questions here. All right. So I guess maybe there are no questions, or I don't know if people get disconnected or something, but oh, maybe there's one. Oh, sorry. Cool. Awesome, Jim. Hey, so you'll have my contact info, and we'll love to chat in the near future. So good luck with that, and let me know how it goes. I guess other than that, so we hit 1 o'clock. I just want to be cognizant of your time. My email is c.proulx, Proulx @digitsole.com. But education@digitsole.com also gets to me. So I want to thank you for your time, and we will see you on the next one. Take care.